You won't believe how far an HOA Karen went to make my life miserable. She towed my truck for no reason, but what she didn't expect was my perfectly legal revenge. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. I had always been a pretty laid-back person when it came to my neighborhood. I paid my HOA fees on time, kept my yard neat enough to avoid complaints, and generally minded my own business. But there was one person in our community who simply couldn't let others live in peace: Karen. If you've ever lived in an HOA-run neighborhood, you know exactly the type. The kind of person who treats the HOA like their personal fiefdom, enforcing rules selectively and making life miserable for anyone they don't like. Unfortunately for me, I had unknowingly found myself on her bad side months ago when I refused to sign some ridiculous petition she had started about banning unapproved decorations during the holidays. Ever since then, she had been watching me like a hawk, waiting for any excuse to cause problems. I didn't think much of it at first. She sent me a passive-aggressive email once about my trash cans being out 5 minutes past collection time. I ignored it. Then she left a note in my mailbox complaining that my lawn was 2 shades too dark compared to the HOA's preferred grass type. I chuckled and tossed in the trash. Little things like that were annoying, sure, but they weren't worth my time. I had a life to live, a job to do, and unlike Karen, I didn't dedicate every waking moment to making others miserable. Then she crossed the line. One morning, I walked out of my house, coffee in hand, ready to leave for work, only to find my driveway empty. My truck was gone. At first, my heart dropped, thinking it had been stolen. But then I saw the bright orange notice taped to my garage door, and my confusion quickly turned to rage. It was an HOA violation notice. According to the paper, my truck had been towed for violating community aesthetics. I stared at the notice in disbelief. My truck was clean, modern, and well-maintained. It wasn't an eyesore. It wasn't blocking the road. It wasn't even parked on the street. It was in my own driveway. I called the towing company immediately, and sure enough, they confirmed that my vehicle had been removed at the request of a board member. I didn't even need to ask who. It was Karen. Livid, I stormed over to her house. She lived just a few doors down from me in one of the biggest homes in the neighborhood, complete with a meticulously manicured lawn that looked like it belonged in a magazine. I banged on her door, and when she finally answered, she had that smug, self-satisfied look on her face that made my blood boil. "Oh, you," she said, feigning surprise. "Is something wrong? You have my truck towed?" I asked, barely keeping my voice steady. She sighed dramatically, leaning against the doorframe. "Yes, I did. Your vehicle was simply not in line with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. I sent a warning last week." That was a blatant lie. I never got a warning. "Karen, my truck was legally parked. It's a perfectly normal vehicle. There's nothing in the HOA rules about this." "Well," she said, giving me a sickeningly sweet smile, "the board decided that large, commercial-looking trucks don't fit our community's vision. So we took action." I clenched my jaw. "You mean you took action? You did this just because you don't like me?" "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she scoffed. "If you have a problem, you can bring it up at the next HOA meeting. But I wouldn't waste your time. It was a unanimous decision." Of course, it was unanimous. The entire HOA board was made up of her friends. Complaining would get me nowhere. I was furious, but I knew arguing with her wouldn't accomplish anything. She wanted me to explode, to make a scene so she could paint me as some unstable neighbor who didn't follow the rules. So instead of shouting, I gave her a cold, calculating smile. "Fine," I said simply. "Enjoy your day, Karen." And then I walked away. I spent the next several hours getting my truck back from the impound lot. It cost me over $500 in fees, not to mention the wasted time, stress, and absolute rage I felt the entire time. But as I drove my truck back home, an idea started forming in my mind. I wasn't just going to let this slide. No, I was going to get back at Karen in a way that was completely legal, yet absolutely devastating. I pulled into my driveway and looked over at her perfect, pristine lawn. She was obsessed with that lawn. It was her pride and joy. She spent thousands on landscaping, personally monitored the HOA's lawn inspections, and even reported neighbors for things as minor as a single weed popping up in their yard. She thought she could control the entire neighborhood's appearance. So what if I gave her exactly what she deserved? What if I turned her perfect lawn into a disgusting, swampy nightmare? And not just a swamp. Oh no, I wanted it to be teeming with snakes. A slow, satisfied grin spread across my face as the plan came together in my mind. Karen had no idea what was coming. Getting revenge on Karen wasn't going to be quick or easy, but I was committed. She had cost me money, time, and my peace of mind by having my truck towed for no reason, and she had done all with that smug look on her face, knowing I couldn't do anything about it, at least not directly. That's why my plan had to be perfect. I wanted something legal, something she couldn't retaliate against, and most of all, something that would completely ruin her precious front yard, the thing she cherished most. So I did my research. It turns out, HOA rules can be extremely specific about what you can't do to your property, but they often have loopholes, and I was determined to find one. Over the next week, I pored over every page of the HOA guidelines, focusing on landscaping rules. Most of it was predictable. No overgrown grass, no unapproved structures, no exotic plants that didn't fit the aesthetic. But then I found it, the loophole that would change everything. The rules explicitly prohibited artificial turf, rock gardens, and desert landscaping. They required residents to maintain green, healthy lawns. But nowhere did it say anything about what kind of soil conditions you could have. There was no rule saying your lawn couldn't be wet. No rule saying your soil couldn't be soft. No rule against your yard being a literal swamp. That's when I knew exactly what I had to do. I wasn't just going to damage Karen's lawn. I was going to transform it into an unlivable, snake-infested nightmare. Step 1. The water problem. Turning her yard into a swamp was going to take some planning, but I had one major advantage. Her property was slightly lower in elevation than mine. That meant if I could introduce enough water flow, her yard would naturally retain it. So I got to work. Late at night, I started digging small, barely noticeable trenches from my yard to hers. They weren't deep, but they were just enough to redirect water. I timed my work carefully, waiting for rain, so any digging I did would blend in with normal rain runoff patterns. Every time it rained, a little more water would trickle into her yard, slowly softening the soil. She wouldn't notice at first, it would just seem a little damp. But I wasn't going for just damp. I needed soaking wet. To speed up the process, I took advantage of an old sprinkler control hack I had learned years ago. I used a cheap, programmable timer system to slightly increase her irrigation schedule. Just a little at first, then gradually more over the next few weeks. Most people don't check their irrigation settings daily, and since Karen wasn't the one personally handling hers, she never noticed. At the same time, I accidentally spilled some water-retaining gel in her front yard. These are little granules landscapers use to retain moisture in dry soil. Except in excess, they hold way too much water, creating a permanently soggy mess. The next time it rained, her front yard didn't dry up. Step 2. The snakes. Now, just having a swampy yard wasn't quite enough. No, I needed one more thing, something that would make Karen absolutely terrified to step outside. Snakes. Now, I wasn't about to break any laws or actually put venomous snakes on her property. But here's the thing. If you change the habitat, the wildlife will come naturally. And do you know what loves wet, marshy conditions? Non-venomous water snakes. So I did some research. There was a small, local conservation area a few miles away that had plenty of water snakes. Completely harmless, but very convincing looking if you don't know the difference. They thrive in damp, overgrown environments. So, over a couple of weeks, I started accidentally making Karen's yard more inviting to them. First, I strategically planted a few moisture-loving plants at the edges of her yard. They attract insects, which in turn attracts small frogs. And where there are frogs, there are snakes. Then, I accidentally left out a couple of small water dishes near her hedges. Nothing obvious, just a little extra incentive for local wildlife. I also lightly disturbed the soil near her fence line, creating little hiding spots. By the time the first snake was spotted, I knew it was only the beginning. Step 3. The breakdown. At first, Karen didn't notice. Her yard just looked a little softer, a little wetter, maybe a little overgrown. She complained to the landscapers, but they couldn't figure out why it was happening. Then came the first snake sighting. It was just a harmless water snake, but Karen lost her mind. She screamed at the HOA meeting, demanding that something be done about the infestation. She called pest control, but they told her the same thing I already knew: the environment was just right for them. Then it rained. And this time her yard didn't just get damp. It became a swampy, disgusting mess. The water pooled, the grass yellowed, and Karen completely flipped out. She demanded the HOA do something. They sent landscapers. They aerated the soil, treated it, and even replanted grass. It didn't help, because by that point, the ecosystem had already shifted. The snakes had already made a home. The excess moisture wouldn't go away. And since everything had happened gradually, there was no clear culprit. She couldn't even blame me. And then came the final blow: her HOA violation. Oh yes, because you see, Karen had spent years enforcing HOA rules on everyone else. But when her lawn failed to meet community standards, when it became an overgrown, muddy, wildlife-infested mess, guess who got a citation? Karen. And the best part? There was no easy fix. She spent thousands trying to undo the damage. She tore up the lawn and replaced the soil, only for the moisture to return. She put out snake deterrents, but the natural habitat kept attracting them back. I never admitted a thing. I just watched for my dry, perfectly green lawn as she suffered in the swamp she deserved. Karen had spent years making life miserable for everyone in the neighborhood, using the HOA as her personal weapon to enforce whatever arbitrary rules she wanted. She had my truck towed for no legitimate reason, and in return, I had legally and methodically turned her perfect lawn into a swampy, snake-infested nightmare. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted more. I wanted her to suffer the way she had made others suffer, to feel powerless for once in her life. I didn't just want to ruin her lawn. I wanted to ruin her reputation and take her down from the inside. And I knew exactly how to do it. By this point, Karen was losing it. Her once pristine lawn had become a soggy, unlivable mess, attracting water snakes, frogs, and insects. Every time she walked outside, she had to deal with squishing mud under her designer shoes, and every time she turned around, there was another snake slithering through her flower beds. It was hilarious watching her freak out in the middle of the street, screaming about how this was unacceptable and how the HOA needed to do something. The irony? She was the HOA. She had spent years making other people fix their problems, fining them, harassing them over tiny infractions. But when it came to her own property, she had no solution. And the best part? She was now getting official violations from the very HOA she controlled. But I wanted to push it further. So, I started talking to my neighbors. See, I wasn't the only one who hated Karen. She had pissed off nearly everyone in the community at some point. She had forced one family to repaint their house because she didn't like the shade of blue. She had fined another neighbor for having a garden gnome, claiming it was unapproved decor. She had even threatened an elderly couple over the size of their mailbox. I started planting subtle seeds of rebellion in every conversation. Hey, did you see Karen got an HOA violation for her lawn? Crazy how she enforced those rules so strictly on us, but now her yard looks like a swamp. I heard she's been fighting with the landscapers. Guess even she can't keep up with her own rules. Man, if any of us a yard looking like that, Karen would have fined us into oblivion. It didn't take long for others to start talking. Neighbors who had stayed silent for years suddenly found their voices. People who had been afraid to speak out started complaining about Karen, publicly. And once that happened, it was only a matter of time before the HOA board started turning against her. Karen had always ruled with an iron fist in the HOA, and most of the board members were just her friends who went along with whatever she wanted. But once people started publicly questioning her, cracks began to form in her control. So, I decided to widen those cracks. I started digging into the HOA's finances. HOA boards are supposed to keep detailed records of expenses, fines, and where the community's money is going. But when I requested copies of the HOA's financial statements, I noticed some serious irregularities. High administrative fees that didn't add up. Landscaping charges that seemed way higher than they should have been. Mysterious consulting fees paid to a company no one had ever heard of. The deeper I looked, the more shady transactions I found. Karen had been funneling HOA money into personal projects. She had been charging the HOA for landscaping work that was never done. Except, funnily enough, her own yard had always looked perfect before the swamp disaster. She had been overcharging residents for fines and using the extra money for expensive board meetings at fancy restaurants. And the best part? I had proof. So, I started anonymously leaking documents to the other board members and key people in the neighborhood. And then, I made one final power move. Once word got out that Karen had been misusing HOA funds, the board had no choice but to hold a community meeting. Karen tried to control the narrative, insisting it was all misinformation and that certain people, gee, I wonder who, were spreading lies about her. But then I stood up, and I laid out every piece of evidence. Copies of shady transactions, records of fake fines and overcharges, receipts for absurd expenses paid by the HOA. The room went silent as I spoke. Karen's face went from defensive to pale and horrified as she realized she was completely screwed. Then the other neighbors started speaking up. Karen fined me $200 for my flower pots, and now we find out she was using that money for steak dinners. So we've been paying inflated HOA fees so she could get extra landscaping on her property. She threatened to sue me over a mailbox, and now she's the one breaking rules? The entire neighborhood turned on her. The HOA board, her own allies, were suddenly distancing themselves from her, desperate to save their own skins. The board voted to remove Karen as president immediately. The HOA also announced that they would be conducting a full audit, and if any of the money had been misused, they would be pressing charges. Karen? She was completely done. But it wasn't over yet. After the meeting, Karen snapped. She tried screaming at me in the parking lot, accusing me of ruining her life. I just smiled. Karen, I said, I just played by the rules. The same ones you always enforced on everyone else. If you can't handle it, maybe you were never fit to run the HOA. That was the last straw. Karen moved out within 2 months. Her house sat unsold for ages because no one wanted a property with a swamp for a front yard. Eventually, she had to sell it for way less than market value, and from what I heard, she lost a ton of money. The HOA, now under new leadership, actually became reasonable. They rolled back a lot of Karen's ridiculous policies, refunded unfair fines, and focused on actual community improvements. And me? I got to enjoy my truck, parked in my driveway, exactly where it belonged. And every time I looked at where Karen's house used to be, I smiled. Because sometimes karma just needs a little push.